The knock on my office door came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, light, hesitant, the kind of knock that says someone drew the short straw and has to deliver bad news. I didn't look up from my quarterly logistics reports, just called out, "Come in," while scanning the distribution numbers Madison had been playing with again. The door opened and shut. Footsteps, then silence. I looked up to see Ryan standing there, fresh legal hire straight out of Georgetown Law, probably still paying off $200,000 in student loans. Kid was holding a tablet like it might detonate. "Sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "you've been terminated. I'm Bob Campbell, by the way, 58 years old, been running operations at Meridian Industries for 25 years. Started here in 1999 when Madison Frost was still in high school, worried about prom dates. Meridian's a mid-sized defense contractor, $2.8 billion annual revenue, 12,000 employees, Pentagon contracts that keep the lights on." I blinked at Ryan. "Terminated?" He nodded, throat working like he'd swallowed a golf ball. I laughed. "Ryan, I've got a DoD review meeting in 90 minutes. Nice try, though. Who put you up to this?" The kid didn't laugh, just turned his tablet toward me and tapped the screen. There it was, a PDF file titled Executive Separation and Buyout Agreement. Robert J. Campbell. Signed, dated, time-stamped 11:30 a.m. I glanced at the wall clock, 2:47 p.m. "Interesting timing," I muttered. "Where did this come from?" HR routed it through the executive transition protocol. "Your security clearance is under review. You're no longer on the active roster for classified projects." That got my attention. My TS-SCI clearance took 18 months to get and cost the company $75,000 in background investigation fees. You don't just yank that on a Tuesday afternoon. The air in my office got thick. I could hear the hum of my encrypted workstation, the nervous way Ryan was shifting his weight like he expected me to call security. I didn't call anyone. Just stared at that screen, then slowly sat back in my chair. The signature looked right. Same angular strokes I'd been using since my Army days. But something was off about the pressure points. "That's not my signature," I said quietly. Ryan squinted at the tablet. "It matches the exemplars in your personnel file." And they said... He hesitated. "Let me guess. Madison and the legal department." He nodded. I smiled. Not a happy smile. More like the smile you get when you finally see the enemy's battle plan and realize they just made a tactical error. "Tell you what, Ryan. Walk with me." "Walk where?" "To the executive conference room." "But sir, the security protocols..." "Son," I said, standing up and straightening my tie, "if you think a forged PDF and some HR paperwork are enough to keep me out of a room I helped design the security for, then you haven't been paying attention to how things work around here." I grabbed my leather briefcase, the one my wife Carol bought me when I made operations director back in 2009, and headed for the door. Ryan followed, clutching that tablet like evidence at a crime scene. As we walked down the hall past the logistics center I'd built from scratch, I thought about how this place looked when I started. Meridian was barely holding on to a few truck maintenance contracts. Now we managed supply chains for 3 Army divisions and had distribution centers in 8 states. All of it designed by a guy who learned logistics moving ammunition and medical supplies with the 101st Airborne in Desert Storm back in '91. When you've kept soldiers alive by getting the right supplies to the right place at exactly the right time, civilian logistics feels like playing checkers after you've mastered chess. And under my calm exterior, something was waking up. Not anger exactly, recognition. I'd seen this kind of flanking maneuver before, just usually aimed at the other guy. When we reached the elevator bank, Ryan swiped his badge. Red light, angry beep. "They killed my executive access too," he said, looking confused. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a brass key. Physical override for the stairwell. Old school security I'd insisted on during the 2015 renovation. When you've served in places where power grids fail and electronic locks become worthless metal, you learn to appreciate mechanical backups. We climbed 4 flights in silence. I didn't break a sweat, just counted steps like I was back in airborne training, measuring distance to the drop zone. Executive floor, corner conference room. Voices inside. Madison's California accent cutting through deeper voices. The sound of expensive coffee cups clinking against imported granite. I reached for the brushed steel door handle. "Bob," Ryan said, swallowing hard. "If that really is your signature." I paused, looked back at him. The kid reminded me of myself at that age. Scared, trying to do right, caught between competing loyalties. "I suppose we'll find out who I really am without a badge," I said. And I pushed open the door. The conversation died like someone had cut the power. 6 board members, 1 polished conference table that cost more than most people's cars. My quarterly presentation still queued up on the 85-inch display. Q3 Operations Review. Robert J. Campbell, Director of Operations and Strategic Logistics. My chair, the one at the head of the table, positioned for maximum visual command of the room, was empty. Until it wasn't. Madison froze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Even at 32, she looked like exactly what she was. Stanford MBA, venture capitalist father, someone who thought disruption meant firing everyone over 45 and replacing them with algorithms. Her blonde hair was pulled back in that severe style favored by women who mistake looking harsh for looking powerful. I stepped into the room like I owned it, which, as it turned out, I was about to. Ryan followed behind me, still clutching that cursed tablet, like it contained nuclear launch codes. Nobody spoke. They didn't know what to say, except Ryan, who'd apparently been coached for this moment. "Excuse me," he announced, voice cracking like a teenager asking someone to prom. "Robert Campbell has been removed from the active roster as of 11:30 this morning." He tapped the tablet with a trembling finger. "Per Section 4B of the Executive Buyout Agreement, his security clearance is under review. This digital signature has been verified through DocuSign's authentication protocols." I stepped forward, looked at that tablet like I was studying a map of enemy positions. My name stared back at me in what looked like my own handwriting. Date, timestamp, even the slight rightward slant I'd developed after breaking my wrist in a parachute training accident in '92. Someone had worked damn hard to make this look authentic. I lifted my eyes slowly from the tablet screen. Across from me sat Sarah Murphy, head of compliance, usually unflappable as a career diplomat. But now she was suddenly fascinated by the condensation rings on the mahogany table, avoiding eye contact like a private caught sleeping on guard duty. I turned to Madison. She didn't speak, didn't blink, just gripped that overpriced ceramic mug, the one with Disrupt or Die printed in minimalist sans serif font. Her knuckles were white against the black surface. "Madison," I said, voice level as a rifle sight, "I think there's been some confusion, a slight twitch in her left eye. The kind of tell that gets people killed in poker games or combat zones." "Look, Bob," she said, trying to sound casual and failing. "Let's take this offline. It's probably just a processing error in the HR system. You know how these digital transitions can be." I raised my hand, sharp, deliberate, the way you signal for radio silence when enemy contact is imminent. "I'd like to begin my presentation," I said, voice cutting through the tension like a K-bar through canvas. Calm, professional, deadly serious. Ryan blinked like someone had shined a flashlight in his eyes. "Sir, you're not on the active roster. The system shows you've already accepted the severance package. There's a 60-day transition period, but you're not authorized for classified briefings." "Then, I suppose this is unclassified information sharing," I replied. "Executive privilege discussion. Nothing that requires clearance levels." Sarah finally looked up, but only to whisper something urgent to the woman beside her. Janet Pierce, our newest board member. Former Goldman Sachs, brought in 6 months ago when Madison started pushing her financial optimization agenda. Janet's eyes went wide, then narrow. She'd seen corporate coups before. One board member, George Martinez, our longest-serving director, coughed and leaned forward. George had been here since the company went public in 2003, back when we were still primarily a regional logistics firm. He'd watched me build our current operation from scratch. Didn't move to sit. Didn't need to. Instead, I opened my briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done countless mission briefings and pulled out a printed copy of my presentation materials. "Slide 1, I said, setting the papers on the table with military precision. Quarterly efficiency metrics and budget allocation analysis, prepared by Robert J. Campbell. I looked directly at Madison. "I assume we're still interested in actual performance data this quarter?" Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, like a fish trying to breathe air. Her eyes darted towards Sarah, looking for legal backup that wasn't materializing. Sarah's lips were pressed into a thin line. She wouldn't touch the situation with a 10-foot non-disclosure agreement and a team of corporate lawyers. "I'd like to proceed," I said again. Same calm voice. Same professional tone. Unless there's a specific reason why the woman who used to ask me to explain the difference between supply chain management and logistics coordination would prefer I leave. Madison flinched like I'd reminded her of something embarrassing from her childhood, which, in a way, I had. A slow, creeping tension began spreading through the room. Not confusion anymore. Most of them were starting to sense the shape of what was happening. But they couldn't see the full picture yet. Couldn't see the tactical situation I'd been developing for the past 6 weeks. See, what they didn't know is that I wasn't there to fight a defensive action. I was there to execute a flanking maneuver that would leave the enemy position completely untenable. And I'd already positioned my forces. 4 weeks earlier, I'd been sitting in this same conference room, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through government-issue paper towels, when I noticed the first intelligence indicator. Nothing dramatic, just a calendar invite I didn't receive, budget planning session, standard quarterly procedure. But the invite went out to everyone in the C-suite except me. I only found out because Tom Rodriguez from Finance mentioned it during our regular Monday morning briefing. You switching your presentation to the Friday slot or just skipping the budget review entirely? Tom had asked, looking at his tablet with a frown. I kept my expression neutral. What budget review? Tom's frown deepened. The quarterly allocation meeting. Madison said she was restructuring the schedule to focus on forward-looking initiatives instead of legacy operations analysis. I smiled, nodded, played it off. Must have missed that memo. There was no memo, no explanation, just silence where there should have been communication. In the Army, we called that communications discipline breakdown. In corporate America, it's called getting frozen out. Same tactical principle. That was intelligence indicator number 1. Number 2 came courtesy of our most caffeine-dependent intern, Kevin Park. Kid was a junior analyst with a Red Bull addiction and a habit of hitting reply all before engaging his brain. He'd meant to forward the new organizational chart to Sarah in legal. Instead, he sent it to bcampbell@meridian.com instead of smurphy@meridian.com. I opened that PDF attachment on a Sunday evening while organizing my tax documents for Carol's accountant. Was halfway through sorting through receipts for business meals when the file loaded on my laptop screen. My name wasn't there. Not transferred, not demoted, not reassigned. Gone. Completely absent from the organizational structure. My entire division, operations and strategic logistics, had been absorbed into something called Integrated Efficiency Management, now being overseen by Madison's latest hire, Josh Park. No relation to Kevin, despite the shared surname. Josh's biggest professional achievement to date was a presentation titled Blockchain Solutions for Supply Chain Optimization that used the word synergistic 14 times in 20 slides. I didn't panic. Didn't call Madison at home. Didn't fire off angry emails. Didn't schedule emergency meetings. Instead, I made a fresh pot of coffee, sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and started writing names. Assets, liabilities, potential allies still inside the company, people who owed me favors, people who might be willing to help if the situation required it. And on a separate page, I wrote 2 words: Bayshore Industries. Bayshore had been my contingency plan since 2008, a shell company I'd established during the financial crisis to manage some real estate investments and logistics consulting contracts. Small stuff, warehouse leases, distribution partnerships, the kind of secondary business that defense contractors often spin off into separate entities for tax purposes. I'd kept it dormant for years, just paying the annual Delaware filing fees and maintaining the corporate registration. Most executives had IRAs and 401k plans. I had a legally constituted business entity that existed in the regulatory shadows, invisible unless someone went looking for it specifically. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Eddie Kowalski, my old logistics sergeant from the 101st, now running a small tax and corporate services firm out of Jacksonville. Eddie specialized in keeping business entities alive on paper when their owners didn't need them active. "Campbell," his voice boomed after the first ring. "Hell, thought you were dead, retired, or living on a beach somewhere. None of the above. I need Bayshore Industries reactivated, full corporate status, Delaware registration current, ability to hold equity positions." A pause. I could hear papers rustling in the background. Still got all the documentation. Federal ID number, articles of incorporation, the works. It's been sleeping in my emergency corporate services file cabinet. Another pause. "You expecting trouble?" I'm expecting a war, I said. Just want to make sure I'm not fighting it with a broken weapon. Eddie laughed, the same laugh I'd heard in a dozen forward operating bases when we figured out how to solve impossible logistics problems with creative paperwork. Give me 48 hours. I'll have Bayshore Industries looking like it never went to sleep. That night, while Madison was probably posting inspirational quotes about disrupting traditional business models on her LinkedIn feed, I was quietly rewriting the corporate structure that would determine who controlled Meridian Industries. And the beautiful thing was, I was doing it all completely legally. 4 weeks before the boardroom confrontation, I was sitting in my home office at 11 p.m., surrounded by corporate documents that hadn't seen daylight since the Clinton administration. The Bayshore Industries files were spread across my desk like battle plans, articles of incorporation, shareholder agreements, tax filings going back to 2008. Eddie had been thorough. Bayshore Industries LLC was now fully reactivated, registered agent updated, Delaware franchise tax current. On paper, it looked like a small but legitimate logistics consulting firm that had been quietly operating for 15 years. What made it interesting wasn't what Bayshore was, but what it owned. Back in 2009, when Meridian Industries went public, the company had issued 3 classes of stock: Class A shares for public trading, Class B shares for employee stock options and executive compensation, and Class D shares, a small batch of founders' equity that had been distributed to early strategic partners and key investors. I owned 500 Class D shares, had bought them through Bayshore Industries as part of a consulting agreement when Meridian was scrambling to meet a major Army logistics contract. The shares were non-voting, non-dilutive, essentially worthless except for one small detail buried in Section 12.7 of the original corporate charter. In the event of involuntary executive separation without board approval, voting authority for any Class D shares would revert to the shareholder of record, with each Class D share carrying voting weight equivalent to 1,000 Class A shares. It was an obscure provision, written by lawyers who were worried about hostile takeovers back when Meridian was still a small regional company. The idea was to prevent outside investors from firing key personnel without proper corporate governance procedures. Madison and her legal team had missed it completely. They were so focused on the standard employment termination procedures that they never bothered to review the foundational corporate documents. Classic mistake, focusing on tactics while ignoring strategy. I spent that night doing math. Meridian had approximately 2.3 million Class A shares outstanding. My 500 Class D shares, if activated, would be equivalent to 500,000 voting shares, roughly 21.7% of the company's voting authority. Not enough for outright control, but more than enough to block any major corporate decisions. And since my termination hadn't been approved by the board, Madison had used an executive authority provision that was intended for routine personnel changes. My Class D voting rights were now active. I made copies of everything, filed the reactivation documents with our corporate secretary, sent certified letters to the Delaware Secretary of State and the SEC, updating Bayshore's beneficial ownership disclosure. All completely legal, all properly documented, all flying under the radar because nobody was watching for it. Then I started building the evidence file. Madison had been busy during her 18 months as CEO, busy making the kind of decisions that look good in PowerPoint presentations, but fall apart under regulatory scrutiny. There was the $1.2 million leadership development initiative that turned out to be management retreats at 5-star resorts where the primary activity was golf. There was the $890,000 in consulting fees paid to Apex Strategic Solutions, a firm that existed only on paper and was registered to the same address as Madison's father's venture capital office. But the real prize was buried in the defense contracting files. Madison had signed a $15 million supply chain management contract with the Defense Logistics Agency, representing Meridian's capabilities in a proposal that listed Josh Park as Director of Operations and Strategic Logistics, a title he'd never officially held and responsibilities he was nowhere near qualified to handle. That wasn't just corporate politics, that was potential federal fraud, the kind of thing that gets companies banned from government contracting and executives fitted for orange jumpsuits. I documented everything, created a timeline, cross-referenced financial records with personnel files, built a case that would make a federal prosecutor's mouth water. 2 weeks before the confrontation, I made my final preparation. I sat in my kitchen on a Saturday morning, using my personal laptop and a digital signature pad I'd bought on Amazon. The resignation letter was already drafted, standard corporate language about accepting buyout terms in the interest of organizational continuity. Boring as unbuttered toast, forgettable as elevator music. But I wasn't going to send it from my corporate email account. That would leave too many digital fingerprints, too many opportunities for IT forensics to trace the timeline. Instead, I logged into the executive assistant portal using credentials I'd memorized during security training updates. Every senior executive had to understand the administrative systems in case of emergency, and part of that training involved temporary access to assistant-level functions. The system logged my access as routine administrative activity. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would trigger security reviews. Just another executive checking travel schedules or meeting logistics. Through the assistant portal, I uploaded my resignation letter with a timestamp of 11:30 a.m., 30 minutes before Ryan delivered the termination notice. The timing had to be precise for maximum psychological impact. I wanted them to think I'd cracked under pressure, signed the papers in a moment of defeat, then spent the afternoon stewing in my office before the HR meeting. It was theater, misdirection, classic military deception. Let the enemy think they'd achieved tactical surprise while you're actually controlling the engagement from start to finish. I also used the portal to trigger the executive transition protocol, the standard procedure for transferring responsibilities when senior personnel leave. I assigned my major projects to Josh Park, knowing he'd be overwhelmed within 48 hours. Threw in some fake priority assignments, meaningless busy work disguised as critical initiatives, to keep him chasing shadows while I prepared the real assault. The final piece was the shareholder notification. Bayshore Industries filed an amended beneficial ownership statement, disclosing its Class D holdings and requesting board representation commensurate with voting authority. Standard corporate paperwork, but it would land on Sarah Murphy's desk like a hand grenade with the pin pulled. By the time Madison figured out what was happening, the legal framework would already be in place. My termination would have triggered the voting rights clause. My Class D shares would be active. And Bayshore Industries, which was me, would control enough voting authority to force a board review of executive actions. I'd learned the principle in Desert Storm. The best way to win a battle is to choose the terrain, control the timing, and make sure the enemy doesn't realize they're fighting until it's too late to change the outcome. Madison thought she was firing an aging operations director who'd outlived his usefulness. What she was actually doing was activating a corporate governance mechanism that would put me in position to destroy her career. The night before the confrontation, I sat on my back porch with a beer, looking up at the stars and thinking about chess games and military campaigns. Carol found me there around midnight. "You're planning something," she said. Not a question. After 30 years of marriage to a former paratrooper, she could read tactical thinking from across the yard. "Just making sure the company survives," I told her. She sat down beside me in the other porch chair, the one I'd built her for our anniversary 3 years ago. "And Madison?" I took a sip of beer, considered my words carefully. "Madison's about to learn the difference between authority and power," I said. "Authority is what they give you. Power is what you take." Carol nodded. She'd been an Army wife long enough to understand the distinction. The next morning, I put on my best suit, packed my briefcase with the documentation that would end Madison's career, and drove to work for what I knew would be either my last day at Meridian Industries or the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Either way, I was ready. The boardroom takedown. Part 4. Back in the conference room, the silence stretched like a taut wire. Madison had gone pale, the kind of color you see on soldiers who've just realized they've walked into a kill zone. She kept looking toward Sarah Murphy like a drowning person hoping for a life preserver that wasn't coming. I opened my briefcase with deliberate precision and pulled out a manila folder. Thick, official-looking. The kind of folder that makes lawyers nervous and executives start thinking about their resignation letters. Before we proceed with the quarterly review, I said, "I think the board should be aware of some irregularities in recent executive actions." George Martinez, our senior board member, leaned forward. George had been around since the Reagan administration, back when corporate governance actually meant something. He'd seen enough boardroom coups to recognize the opening moves. "What kind of irregularities?" he asked. I slid the folder across the polished table. Unauthorized budget reallocations, misrepresentation in federal contract proposals, Potential violations of the False Claims Act. The words hit the room like incoming artillery. Janet Pierce actually dropped her pen. Sarah Murphy's hands moved to the folder immediately, her compliance training kicking in. She opened it, scanned the first page, and her expression went from confusion to alarm to something approaching panic. "These are allegations of federal fraud," she said quietly. "These are documented violations of federal contracting regulations," I corrected. The allegations part comes later when the Defense Criminal Investigative Service starts asking questions. Madison finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous. Bob, you're obviously upset about the transition, but making wild accusations." "Ryan," I said, not taking my eyes off Madison, "would you please read Section 12.7 of the Corporate Charter? It should be in your legal database." Ryan fumbled with his tablet, fingers flying across the screen. Kid was smart enough to know he was witnessing something that would either make or destroy careers. Section 12.7, he read, voice steadier now. Shareholder voting rights in cases of involuntary executive separation. In the event that any executive holding Class D equity is terminated without formal board approval, voting authority for said equity shall be activated, with each Class D share carrying voting weight equivalent to 1,000 Class A shares. The room went dead quiet. You could have heard a mouse sneeze. George Martinez was already pulling up corporate records on his tablet. "How many Class D shares are outstanding?" 500 shares, I said, all held by Bayshore Industries LLC. Janet Pierce looked up from her own tablet. That's 500,000 equivalent voting shares, roughly 21.7% of total voting authority. Madison's face had gone from pale to gray. "You can't. This is a technicality, a loophole." "This is corporate governance," I replied. "The same corporate governance you ignored when you signed my termination papers without board approval." Sarah Murphy was speed reading through the documents, her legal training in overdrive. "The DLA contract," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "We listed Josh Park as Director of Operations, but he was never formally appointed to that position. Josh Park is a junior analyst with an MBA and 6 months of experience," I said. "Representing him as Director of Operations on a $15 million federal contract constitutes material misrepresentation. That's a felony under 18 U.S.C. 1341. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Federal fraud charges weren't just career-ending, they were life-ending. George Martinez cleared his throat. "I move for an emergency executive review under Section 9.4 of the corporate bylaws." "Seconded," Janet Pierce said immediately. "All in favor?" Hands went up around the table like semaphore flags. Madison didn't raise hers, but it didn't matter. She was already outvoted. "Motion carries unanimously," George said. "Madison, I'm sorry, but pending this review, you're suspended from CEO duties effective immediately." Madison sat there for a long moment, staring at the table like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, defeated. This wasn't supposed to happen this way. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. You were supposed to fire me quietly, restructure the company around your friends, and ride the defense contracts I built into a nice IPO exit. Classic private equity playbook." I stood up, straightened my tie, and looked around the table at faces that were still processing the tactical situation. "I won't be accepting the CEO position," I said. This got their attention. George blinked. "Bob, with your shareholding position." "I never wanted the throne," I said. "I wanted the incompetent pretender off of it." Janet Pierce leaned forward. "Then who do you recommend?" I'd been thinking about this for weeks. "Tom Rodriguez. He's been quietly fixing Madison's accounting disasters for months. Never took credit, never complained, just did the work. More importantly, he understands the difference between leadership and management." There were nods around the table. Tom had been with the company for 12 years, had an engineering background, understood both the technical and financial sides of the operation. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a sealed envelope. Thick paper, my name written across the front in my own handwriting. "My actual resignation," I said, handing it to Sarah. "Dated today, signed with my actual signature, effective close of business." Sarah took it with both hands like she was handling evidence at a crime scene. I didn't wait for questions or protests, just nodded once to the room and walked toward the door. Behind me, the chaos began immediately. Phones buzzing, emergency calls to legal counsel, crisis management protocols kicking into gear, Madison asking about severance packages and being told that terminated for cause executives don't get golden parachutes. I walked through the halls of Meridian Industries one last time, past the logistics center I'd built, past the offices filled with people who'd wake up tomorrow and find out their company had been saved by the old-timer they thought was ready for the scrap heap. At the elevator, I pulled out my phone and opened my text messages. One new message from Eddie Kowalski. Saw the SEC filings. Nice work, Sergeant. Drinks are on me next time you're in Jacksonville. The elevator arrived, doors opened. I stepped in, pressed the button for the parking garage. Down I went, calm and quiet, victorious. 25 years of experience doesn't just disappear because some MBA thinks experience is obsolete. Sometimes the old dog knows a few tricks the puppies haven't learned yet. Sometimes institutional knowledge beats algorithmic thinking. Sometimes the veteran wins. They tried to erase me from their organizational chart. Instead, I'd rewritten their corporate structure. When the elevator doors opened in the parking garage, I walked out into the afternoon sunlight knowing I'd left them exactly where they belonged, picking up the pieces of a game they thought they'd already won. Carol was waiting in the car, engine running, looking at me with that expression she got when she knew I'd accomplished something important, but dangerous. "How did it go?" she asked. I got in, buckled my seatbelt, and smiled for the first time in weeks. "Mission accomplished," I said. She put the car in drive and we headed home. Behind us, Meridian Industries was learning a hard lesson about the difference between authority and power, between disruption and destruction, between being young and being right. Sometimes experience wins. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Sometimes the guy who's been there longest is the one who should be calling the shots. And sometimes, when they come for you with their fancy degrees and their buzzword presentations, the best defense is a good offense. 25 years in logistics taught me one thing above all others. Timing is everything. Get your supplies to the right place at the right time, and you win. Get them there early, and you win bigger. I'd been preparing for this battle for 6 weeks. They'd been preparing for maybe 6 minutes. In the end, it wasn't even close.